Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to be talking with Fortinet today. To remind you of who I am, my name is Kyle Dickinson. I'm a senior solution architect with AWS, focusing on threat detection and incident response. And today I am joined by Aidan. Aidan, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be with you. Uh, I'm Aidan Walden. I'm at Fortinet, responsible for cloud architecture and engineering. I lead that practice globally at Fortinet.
Sounds like a very important job to have. Now, what I'm really actually excited about is, when we were chatting it up, you mentioned that we're actually going to be talking about something different today. And what is it that you want to be talking about to help solve problems that you've been, experiencing or hearing that customers are having on a regular basis?
Yeah, well, I think what makes for a good podcast is interesting conversation, right, Kyle? So I don't know that anybody wants to show up for a product pitch for 20 minutes, but it occurs. What I think is interesting is what we talk to customers about every day, right? And customers are trying to figure out how to move large IT estates into cloud. And I think specifically the conversation is really interesting around specific verticals lately. Financial services is the most interesting. I think as an institution, they are moving through a cloud adoption cycle that's very aggressive, and it's a top-down effort across the industry. And they're coming to us and with this kind of concerns and questions that about how do I move my entire practice, my IT practice, into cloud and make it cloud first and cloud oriented. And so this is just a typical conversation that we have pretty much every day, Kyle. Customers are saying, hey, you guys have security products. What security products do I need? How are they better? And you end up getting into a tooling conversation. And, I think that's oftentimes jumping the gun because the tooling, there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of good tools. But if the tooling doesn't fit the needs of your organization, the way your organization is structured, and the plan that you've created and the strategy that you have for making a move into cloud, adopting the cloud as your primary IT platform, then I think you're wasting a lot of time and money and not getting the value out of that tooling. So the conversation that that we typically have, I think, starts around how the organization is structured and how a company builds a cloud adoption framework that's very personalized for their business.
Are you finding that, when an organization is moving to adopt cloud technologies in AWS, that some parts of the organization might have more hands-on before the rest of the organization starts utilizing the cloud technologies available to them?
Well, absolutely, right? I think what you're talking about is the canary efforts that have started over the years. You have lines of business that have their own interests and their own needs for agility and to solve problems. And so whether they're creating their own accounts and putting on credit cards and deploying applications on their own outside of the larger context of the IT framework, that's how it typically starts. And sometimes you have this sprawl of a state that is really just shadow IT that the organization is not fully aware of. If I look at Fortinet as a cloud customer and a cloud consumer ourselves, our own story is that we had thousands and thousands of AWS accounts and other cloud accounts, but those thousands of AWS accounts were on credit cards. They rolled up to individual cost centers, and there was no structure to it. They didn't exist under a standard organization that was set up for Fortinet. So there were a couple problems, right? We didn't have cost controls, and we did not have the kind of corporate security rigor that we have in the rest of our business. And so that's one challenge, right? Getting organized to figure out what you have before you even start moving in the cloud from a top-down perspective. Like think of it, as business leaders thinking, okay, we're going to move to cloud. Well, you're probably already there, and you probably have a lot more in cloud than you realize. And so getting your arms around the cost, the costs of cloud, cost optimizing it, building an organizational hierarchy that fits your business and the different lines of business, and then getting your arms around identity and controls, and then applying the corporate security structure that you need for that environment that fits with the rest of your IT framework. That's very important, right? And then you can do things like define permissions and address the IAM needs of each of the business units and individuals, and then you start to apply governance, right? So once you figure out organizational alignment and you uncover the shadow IT, and there are a lot of tools to do that. Fortinet has some fantastic tools that expose shadow IT in cloud. Then you can start to apply governance, right? Whatever formal framework or business specific framework that you have. But that's very important, right? So before you start getting into what next generation firewall is going to be the best firewall for me, I think some of those organizational requirements are first, right? But you bring up a good point, and we've gone through those same pains ourselves, and they were somewhat painful.
Yeah, and when you have accounts that aren't centrally managed or governed, you have an imbalance in security controls, and that could lead to other issues downstream. Um, but the early adopters and when organizations are moving, one common pattern I see often is the teams that are responsible for bringing cloud technologies to an organization are often the ones that are becoming the go-to individuals for how to do something within AWS, and that leads other teams from security operations and those various other teams within security operations having to play catch up because they haven't been the ones bringing AWS technologies into their organization. But now that their organization is utilizing AWS technologies, it's going, okay, how do we transform the service offerings that we have, be it vulnerability management, incident response, threat detection, threat modeling, to our organization utilizing these new technologies? What would you say is something that you've seen that helps kind of address those types of patterns?
I would say that the technology. So we break it down into three different views on the cloud estate, right? So there's the network and SDN layer. There's the applications that ride on the network. And then there's the overall platform. So kind of all of it runs on the platform, right? And so the first opportunity that the company typically has is visibility, right? And so getting visibility into what your cloud estate looks like, where all of your VPCs are deployed and what regions they're deployed and what workloads are running. All that's very important, right? And so I think once you get a view of what that existing footprint looks like, then you understand, well, what should it look like? And then you could say, we've worked with customers who have said, I would like to have as an example, a standard Terraform
template.
Like a standard state. Sorry, I want to have an overall Terraform state for what my cloud should look like. We use HashiCorp's product as an example, and everything should be deployed via Terraform, and that's our standard, right? And that's a good standard. And then everything that exists outside of that is unsanctioned. And so, having a tool that can incorporate, things like Terraform, and then give you a delta between what should be there and what you actually have, is a good starting point for visibility.
And so that almost sounds like a directive control, which would kind of align with the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework too. If we're talking about the security perspective, you have multiple controls. You have directive, detective, responsive, and preventative. And directive is essentially saying, we are going to use this technology to accomplish this outcome. And standardizing across that allows you to build your governance and security around that. Going back, you mentioned creating visibility.
Hmm.
what workloads do we have? What systems do we have with VPCs? It's almost sounding like you need to start with an asset inventory first. You got to know what you have to understand how you need to secure it and what governance you need to have around it, right?
Exactly. And so asset inventory, but then understanding what is the necessity of the asset. If you There's a lot of tooling out there that will show you, hey, here is all that you have in cloud. It's just a dump. It's like a data dump. It shows you a list of resources and IDs that may not make a lot of sense on the surface. But the goal is to say, all right, I have a workload maybe in AWS that's running in my ERP, and it's got intellectual property, or it has customer data, right, PII, in it and on it, or on that disk, or on those disks. And then maybe I've got other workloads that are just unimportant. Maybe they're dev, or
Like
workloads that don't
non-business
have,
critical.
yeah, non-business critical. Thank you. And so differentiating between the criticality of those workloads, which is going to be unique to each business, by the way, right? It's not the
Yeah.
same for everybody. But being able to define those and then highlight that from a risk analysis perspective is really important. I think one of the things that customers that they have asked us most is, help me. I've got a lot of tools, but nothing identifies risk very well. And there are a lot of AWS native solutions out there, like Inspector and Guard Duty and Security Hub, as a feeder of all of these findings, Macy. And these are great tools. One of the things those tools guarantee you is that when you turn them on, they give you full estate visibility, right? And then, is there a way to use those native tools that are going to give you great breadth and visibility in a way that takes all of that good data, right? Because it's a volume of data, and how do you make that data useful? And so, when organizations are looking at the visibility problem, risk needs to be a part of the visibility solution. And so, can I take all that data using good tools in AWS that give me great estate visibility, and then making that data most useful to determine risk? And risk is based on, is a workload more important or less important, right? Because that makes it specific to the business.
Yeah, and the whole one of the common questions that we get, from my perspective is, how do we measure the risk? And really, it all goes back to, as you mentioned earlier, it depends. What is your organization in? What industry? What kind of regulated requirements do you have? What kind of
Hmm.
data it is that you're working with? Because let's just say that we're not going to build the same type of security and controls around Kyle's website that hosts, dog photos, compared to, a financial services industry that has an application that's processing thousands of bank transactions a minute,
Right.
So that whole threat modeling allows you to cost optimize, but
Yes.
also understand what are the risks and how you can mitigate those risks,
Yeah.
and
And
detect if that risk were to be, exposed.
exactly. And there's a lateral aspect of that too, because if Kyle's dog page is in the same VPC as my other critical workloads, and I've got some concerns there, right? And so, I need to be able to see that. I think that's important. And so I think some of the advanced analytics that can be provided, to give you that context are important. And I'll have to get that URL from you. I love
Yeah.
dogs.
Yeah, it's yet to be publicized yet, but I'm sure it'll be highly available using some sort of
There
cloud
you go.
distribution network, a content delivery network, edge locations.
Yep. Hmm.
So, and coming from, working with customers, and then prior to my life at AWS, you mentioned, tools. There's tons of different tools, and there's development teams that like to work with their own particular tool sets because that's just how they like to operate.
Hmm.
How have you found, having different development teams using different tools to centralizing or kind of standardizing what tools are permitted to be used, um, to create more governance and strategy around an organization adopting cloud technologies?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's easy to solve that problem because application developers are very particular, I'll say, about the tooling that they like to use and they feel most productive using. Um, I think as a security practitioner, I like if I can implement security into the tooling, right? And it's very much an ecosystem issue, right? So customers are defining their own ecosystem. They don't want a vendor to come in and say, hey, like use only this tool or only that tool because that's what integrates with me. I think having the security apparatus conform to the customer's ecosystem and provide that kind of flexibility is important. And it's something that we've tried to, a concept that we've tried to adopt at Fortinet in our security fabric approach. But whether whatever IDE a customer or a developer might be using, or whatever pipeline tool they might be using, what's important is that the security tooling that integrates to that brings the different personas involved in the delivery of those applications and the security of those applications in cloud together, to align them, right? It comes down back to workflows and organizational alignment. Like, so if I'm an application developer, I'm pushing, I'm developing my application and whatever tool I want to use. The security tooling is aware of me doing so, and I'm pushing that application into a Jenkins pipeline maybe, or some other tooling, and the DevOps team has visibility and has a security responsibility there. So it becomes like the application has security applied every step of the way, right? So in that way, the tooling is conforming to the organizational constructs and facilitating a workflow across different personas that need to be involved, right? Even into cloud infrastructure teams.
I call that going from being a bouncer to a bodyguard, instead of
Yeah,
saying yes and no and yes and no, going along the journey of, providing the best development experience, but also saying, hey, if you're about to do something that's going to introduce unnecessary risk, we're going to highlight that and say you should probably not do this. And if you
hmm
try to do it, we'll just, stop it.
exactly. And just to go back to a point you were making, Kyle. I mean, if you really want to limit, the types of tooling people use and the types of things that there are tools within cloud that allow you to limit the scope of available services, and I think practitioners are familiar with like marketplace and IAM scopes and all that, can also influence that.
So it was awesome to talk to you. And if you had one thing to tell customers that are starting their cloud journey
Mhm.
and are part of large organizations, I mean, even small organizations, I believe, can benefit from a lot of the
Mhm.
lessons learned that large organizations have too.
Absolutely.
What would you say is like the piece of information that could really hit home and, they could take away to ease their adoption journey?
I'll probably give you multiple bullets here, if that's okay, Kyle. So, one, take a structured approach to cloud adoption. Understand what the outcomes, why you're adopting cloud. Develop an organizational plan with clear lines of responsibility and a risk management approach, right? So risk is so important in the cloud. If it goes sideways, it's just it's it's terrible. So, and then understand once you have your organizational alignment for cloud, you've organized your IT around the cloud infrastructure, and application delivery in the cloud. Then start to refine the tooling that you use, because the tooling should conform to the organization. It should also facilitate workflow automation, right? Because there's only so many people. There's only so much in terms of signal volume individual practitioners can handle from a security perspective. And so this tooling should be intelligent enough to distill what is important, provide correlations, and drive automation and remove the hands-on touch points that from the actual practitioners, right? So that they can do more valuable things.
Yeah.
And if you do that, I think you'll have a successful cloud journey where security is considered at the beginning of the process and not an afterthought.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, man.
Awesome. Aidan, thank you so much for your time today. It was great to talk to you about this topic. And really, this is something that I feel like a lot of us, have gone through or maybe currently going through. So thank you again, Aidan, for your time. And everyone, thank you for listening. I'm Kyle Dickinson, and this was Aidan Walden from Fortinet. Thank you very much.
Thank you.